In the previous video, I mentioned laminating these pieces in superglue, and there's not a whole lot to say on the process. It's mostly a matter of just getting an even coating that seeps into the material, which gives it a nice hard shell that's easier to sand and smooth out. The only other thing that's really worth mentioning on the topic is that large amounts of superglue will give off fumes that sting the eyes and nose and throat. Of course, do not breathe deeply of this sort of thing if you decide to laminate things with superglue as I have. Do it in a well-ventilated area, and if it's really irritating you, then maybe you should look into getting some protective gear, better ventilation, so on. Or you could simply use a better method than superglue and cardstock and such like I'm doing. Should go without saying that if I had access to, say, a laser cutter, a 3D printer, or fancy equipment like that, there would be far better ways and far easier ways to do this sort of thing. But unfortunately, I'm just a guy with a little craft table and a pile of tools and random materials, so I make do with what I have. However, if you happen to have access to better facilities and tools and materials, then by all means, do not follow my example. This is just the way I've decided to do things for this particular project. Once the lamination process was done, I sprayed these things down with a little bit of the matte enamel I was using for the gondolas in the previous project, and gave them a sanding so they would have a nice even surface that everything would be sealed together. Of course, they're not pretty, but that's perfectly fine. I just need them to be mold worthy, which is exactly what I did next. So with these mold boxes, I tried to keep things simple, but I also tried to conserve space where I could because I didn't need to waste a lot of silicone on these molds. Since the pieces are flat and small, they don't need to be especially deep or thick around the walls of the mold. They just need to cover enough of it and not sag or deform when standing on their own. In the video, you can even see here I'm attaching a small little plastic ring to the center of the little circular one there, just as a means to kind of not waste silicone on that big empty space. And this is just a consideration to make when you're planning these things out, just because silicone's not super expensive, but it's not super cheap either. And you also don't want to put yourself in a situation where you are making a mold that takes more material than you have to use. If you've watched my other videos, you probably know that that is a problem that can happen. But with the mold boxes made, I went and sprayed them down with mold release and used a technique I'd seen mentioned online, literally called spray brush spray. That is, you do one coating, you brush it into all the little cracks and crevices, and then you spray it down again, just so you don't get any air bubbles or anything trapped like that on the surface of the mold. Now, since I want these pieces to come out as flat as the original and not to have any sort of liquid imbalance, I set up a flat, leveled out area on my work table to pour these molds on. And what this does is it gives me something that once the mold is done and flipped over, it'll more or less sit level on a flat surface, and that'll mean that the liquids inside it won't necessarily lean too far one way or the other. Yet again, not necessarily a super important thing depending on the nature of what it is you are making a mold out of, but it is a consideration to keep in mind. And since I know for a fact that my little work table here doesn't sit level, I made sure to kind of shim up either side of it with bits of cardboard and paper and whatever I had around before I got my silicone ready to pour. There's not much to say about the pouring process for this one, just straightforward with the good old-fashioned bombs away method, which, if you're not aware, it's a nice way to get around the need for a degassing chamber, which is used to evacuate all of the air bubbles out of a batch of silicone. Instead, what you do is raise your cup of uncured silicone as high as you can get it and then you pour a very thin strand very slowly so it carefully creeps out over the rest of the mold and fills it, eliminating as many of the air bubbles as possible. And then very similar method for the second mold, just with the extra consideration not to get any of the silicone into that center ring, which is saving me a bit of space, and worked out that I didn't need to mix anything more than this, and I had exactly enough left in one of the bottles I had on hand to fill out both of these molds. Once I started opening the molds, the first thing I encountered was the realization that a small amount of silicone had gotten underneath the pieces because I had used a pretty cheap kind of double-sided tape to seal them down. But that was because I didn't want to permanently mark up or hot glue the pieces down, because I needed these to be as flat as possible. And we'll kind of get into the why of that a little later. But needless to say, after having to clean these guys up, I would recommend using a stronger kind of double-sided tape if you're going to do something like this. As it turns out, the extra little bit of silicone that got underneath each mold worked out in my favor, because it gave me a little bit of extra depth when it came to pouring my pieces out. As I've said before, it's a little bit easier to have a piece that's too big that you need to carve down than having one that's too small that you need to make bigger. So I would rather have these things be just a bit oversized instead. The resin pouring process isn't anything special. I just used my good old favorite Smoothcast 300 just because it gives nice, sturdy results. But one thing I did do a little bit differently, and we're going to cut ahead here. While the resin was still curing in the molds, I prepared some little armature wire and set those right into the still kind of gummy silicone and let those sink in, because that would it would distribute a little bit of the liquid, so it would fill the mold just a little more, but it also made each piece a little bit more durable and sturdy. Helped it to keep its shape and not warp as much once it had dried out and cured and everything. Now, the wire isn't anything too special. It's just 14 gauge galvanized wire. You can get it at any hardware store, and I want to say this 100-foot spool ran me about $10 or so. Now, it's sturdy enough to be used as like a armature internal supporting material, but soft enough that you can work it with your hands and kind of sculpt it to the size you need. Works well with pliers, of course, but it's not so hard that you need any kind of special tool to cut it, so yet again, you can just use pliers for that. Depending on the kind of projects you're using, a 100-foot spool will last you a very long time. So I would maybe recommend picking some of this stuff up, because it's going to be very useful to have around for all kinds of projects. With all of that out of the way, it was mostly just a matter of repeating the process. Used both my molds multiple times, created 5 inner rings, and 8 spokes of sorts. Now, I mentioned that the molds had come out just a little bit deeper because of that extra silicone, and what that amounted to was a lot of these pieces came out a little thicker. This isn't a terrible problem to have, but what it meant was a lot of my parts were going to fit together the way I had kind of mathed them out to fit. Being, you know, a full millimeter thicker than what I had intended meant it's not going to fit in that, you know, 5 millimeter hole that I had set up on these little inner rings, or that they wouldn't be able to snap into the slots I had carved into the sides there. And unfortunately, this meant lots and lots and lots of sanding. Fortunately, the process is kind of simple. It's just very tedious and very time consuming, and creates a whole lot of dust. But most of what I had to do was just clean up the edges, get everything straight and square, make sure that it all lines up properly, and then either thin down the column pieces there or widen the holes up on the little inner rings until everything popped together. And after making a big old mess and getting dust on everything in the craft room, and then vacuuming, cleaning it all up, I did eventually end up with pretty good results. And with all of that done, and now that I have the molds and everything, should a part break or should something go wrong, it's easy enough for me to just replace it. I've dialed in kind of the exact amount of material, of resin, that I need to fill each mold, and the casting process only takes, 15-20 minutes at most. It's just the sanding and prepping that are going to cause the most problems. So from here I can more or less put an end to the videos on just making this one aspect of the Scoutfly lantern. I haven't really had the chance to talk about Monster Hunter that much at all. I am trying to play more, but that's neither here nor there. In the next few videos, we're going to be getting into making the little top part of the cylinder. Still debating a few different ways to do this, and how I would like to attach all the parts, because of course I will need them to be securely attached, but I also have to consider how I'm going to be assembling all these parts. As you can see on the top of each of these little pieces, I added a little nib, a little nub that extends a little bit further than the measurements kind of said it should. And that's to kind of give it a little lip that can latch into a little top piece that will sit on the bottom of the cylinder. This will all make sense once I get into the next video, but yeah, I think I'll just leave you with a glimpse at a semi-finished version of how it looks now, and the next video will get into making the cylinder, and sooner or later after that I'm going to have to tackle the LED element of this. However, that is a problem for the future, and I won't get too hung up worrying about things that I don't even have parts to put them in yet. So we'll burn the LED bridge when we cross it. But yet again, I will continue to try to do videos once a week. Still adjusting to my current work schedule, but I don't think it's going to be too much of a problem for me to continue doing regular work on my stuff. I believe I've settled on which Monster Hunter armor I want to actually build, but seeing how slow I'm working right now, I'm a little worried about taking on that project in between doing videos. So maybe I'll settle on doing shorter videos that are less labor intensive to put together, and just work on doing work. But anyways, the usual spiel applies. Like, comment, subscribe, tell your friends. If you do have questions or suggestions, leave those in the comments too, or drop me a message or whatever. I would be happy to hear from any one of you. And I suppose I will see you in the next video. So, till then.